A very daunting task to discuss disaster response, emergency planning, homeland security for this topic in 10 minutes. As you can imagine, certainly is not possible. As an academic, it's one of those things where I could teach a 12-week course on this. If I was dealing with a private organization, it would take days, sometimes weeks. I've got just 10 minutes of your time, so certainly I can only focus on one aspect of disaster response. And what I want to do at the time that I do have is focus on the need for the private sector, the business sector, to work together with government agencies to deal with responding to security threats involving water. Now, generally for the person on the street, when we deal with a security threat, most people will tell you it's government's obligation. It's a government agency that has to respond. But many of us know, and we've heard many discussions today, that maybe sometimes government isn't the only way we respond to a disaster. And certainly, as many of you probably know in your professional careers, or you know from some of the talks earlier today, 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country is owned by businesses. How can government be the one-all-stop solution to emergency planning or handling a disaster when business controls so much of that which is vital in the United States? And we can't forget that. It's something that I find even with dealing with many law enforcement personnel. They kind of have the bravado of, well, when there's a problem, we're going to handle it. And I agree with that. But certainly, it's almost a selfish perspective, and I don't mean to say that in a controversial way. Problems of this nature, especially water, are a public problem that has to be addressed by everybody, not just law enforcement, but all the business organizations that rely on water. And I'm not going to use any more of my time to discuss that, but certainly today and throughout this conference I've discussed the vitality and necessary requirements of water for organizations to function, for food, for manufacturing. It's just something we need to realize as I go through this, that it's not a law enforcement problem, it's not a business problem, it's a joint problem that has to be addressed when there is the need to protect a vital area involving water, or in responding to any type of situation which is now reaching an epidemic or a disaster conditions based on what is happening to water. And I like to use this quote from one of my colleagues who's here today, and I'm going to keep his name as a confidential source here. But notice the quote. This is simple. When the government gives me money to do something to mitigate a security threat with water, I'll do it, but it's not coming out of my pocket. And this is an understanding we need to realize. If 85% of the critical infrastructure, including water, is in the hands of business, they may not spend the money on security or on protection or on coming up with business continuity planning addressing their specific organizational needs unless A, they're made to by law from government, or B, they are provided the funding. That's an economic and it's a legal reality. And I deal with a lot of businesses as a consultant, and when it comes to security, many of you can agree with me or disagree with me on this point, but when money has to be cut somewhere from a budget of a business, what's one of the first things that's cut? It's usually security. And in this area, especially the area of water, that can be a dangerous attitude, not to mention a policy to consider. The benefits of these partnerships in various security fields and what we need in the area of water provide numerous different benefits. Certainly, joint training, exercising, and planning. Even before that, just developing the relationships. When there's a crisis, and many of you who are in law enforcement, you know this, is it better to have a great plan, or is it better to know who to call? It's like the old saying, what is the value of your college education? Who you know, and who you know. And I'm an academic saying that. In security, it's better to know the right people. Who are the people in the right positions, both in businesses and in government agencies, to call when information needs to be shared, or certainly when a disaster is looming or is now upon us. These partnerships provide that. They provide the networking, they provide the communication ahead of time. But also, too, what we see when we have these partnerships in place, we can avoid neglected areas in security. Especially in water, we do have a lot of neglected areas. For example, if we had a uniform set of partnerships, many of these dams, and I'm not going to spend too much time because I know previous presentations discussed such areas, dams often are areas which should be considered vital areas. But without these partnerships, you see situations like this. Here's a dam near Pittsburgh. Now, if the dam is such a vital area for water protection, why is it that I could drive up to it and the some easy bolt cutters, open up the gate, and pretty much do what I want. Wouldn't a partnership provide information that such a situation like this perhaps is negligence, perhaps is dangerous? Now, as mentioned before, I am an attorney. One of my areas is helping businesses avoid lawsuits. I know attorneys get a bad rap, but for those in the audience who don't like attorneys, as far as you're concerned, I am in remission. We're not as bad as everybody thinks. And if I was advising a business of their security, this is a problem. Partnerships allow the sharing of information, the joint training I mentioned before, to prevent situations like this from occurring. Between businesses, between the private sector and the public sector, certainly can help us prevent attacks, can certainly help us prevent security threats, and certainly can help us mitigate situations before they become full-blown disasters. A crisis is always a situation where, if it's addressed properly, it does not emerge to the next step, which is a disaster. These partnerships in the area of water would allow a situation to not reach a disaster standpoint, get done properly. And lastly, I always point this out, we always focus on corporations, and corporations working with government agencies. Well, many of us know, and many of us are representative of these organizations. Corporations have been doing business continuity. They've been doing emergency planning. They've been working with local government agencies for decades now. One of the problems we have, and it's the last point I'll leave you with, is the Achilles heel as far as security in this area with water, is the fact small and medium-sized businesses are not aware of emergency planning. They're not aware of business continuity. They're not aware that if there's a major disaster, how do they address specific water needs that affect the function of their business and the safety of their personnel. That requires awareness, and it's certainly an area that I do my best to try and raise, but certainly all of us can do our part to kind of raise this for the organizations in this country, which are the backbone of our nation. Thank you for your time. I went as fast as I could with the 10 minutes I had. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before all of you today.